Hi, I'm Greg Sheridan from Sheridans Accountants and Financial Planners, an accounting and financial planning firm in Glenelg, South Australia. We've made several videos on common topics of interest to our clients, such as running a self-managed super fund, how to invest money, setting charge rates for tradespeople and professionals, and how to quote jobs. And today's video is on investing in residential property, a pretty popular topic. Those people that have been around for 20 or 30, 40 years know that real estate in Australia goes like this. Nothing much happens for a period of time, then the market goes mad for 3 or 4 years and prices double or triple. They drop off a bit, nothing much happens for a period of time, market goes mad again, drops off a bit, and so on. And this period from here to here is about 10 to 12 years, and this period from here to here is about 6 to 8 years. And if you think about it, back in 1982 would have been about here, here was about 1988, and then here was about 1999. So there's a period of about 10 or 12 years going from peak to peak. So when looking at a property, you've got to look at the property cycle and know that obviously the best time to buy is around this early time, just before there's about to be a growth spurt in property. And a dangerous time to buy is when it's had a peak, because then it takes so much longer to get your money back. If you look over the last 100 years in Australia, house prices generally have risen by between 7 and 10%. In Sydney, prices are more like about 10% per annum, and in Adelaide, 7 or 8% per annum. But it doesn't go up steadily each year at 7% each year. It goes up in spurts. It might have nothing or no growth or even negative growth for several years, and then have a spurt where prices, as I said, double or triple. Now, the reason I'm in favour of people investing in residential property or investing in anything generally is you need to put money away for your retirement, and people have got choices. So as an example, if you've got $20,000, you might have a choice of buying a car, putting it in some form of investment, or investing in a property. So with that $20,000 at year one, you can buy a car, put it in an investment, or buy a property. But of course you can't buy a property for $20,000. You need to borrow money to get up to the full value of the property. Let's assume the property is worth $200,000 and you have to borrow $180,000. So what's not important is the value of the property and the amount you've borrowed. Of course we'll go into those things later on. But that's the amount of your money, your equity, $20,000. Now, what happens, we'll assume properties aren't growing at 7 or 10. Let's say they're growing at 6% and the investment grows at 6%. What happens, at 6%, it means something doubles in 12 years. So let's look 12 years ahead. Of course, we know a car won't grow at 6%. It'll have a negative return. So in 12 years' time, that car might only be worth $5,000. But your investment has doubled to $40,000, and your house property growing at 6% over 12 years would be worth $400,000. And then if we look ahead another 12 years, property is a long-term investment, as most capital growth assets are. In another 12 years' time, the car's worth nothing, or it might be worth a few $100s of scrap value, or in fact it's probably starting to appreciate in value because it's an antique. The investment has doubled again to $80,000, and your property has doubled again to $800,000. Now let's assume you've just been paying interest on your loan, and we'll go into interest only and principal and interest later on. But that means you would still owe you $180,000, and your equity is 620. So once again, that's not important, your equity is important, and that's what it's grown to. So one thing investing in growth assets like property is you get that compound capital growth over time. Your gearing, that means borrowing, so you're getting capital growth on the bank's money, and you're saving for retirement. By paying that loan off and capital growth, you're forced to save, and I'm all in favour of forced saving. Now, I'll just wrap that off, and we'll look at negative gearing. So, how negative gearing works, gearing is another word for borrowing. Negative means that your expenses are more than your income. So as an example, let's say you've bought a house for $200,000 and you're renting it out, and you get rental income of $13,000. $200 a week. And let's assume your expenses are, council rates are $800 a year, water rates are $800 a year, insurance on the house is $600. Let's say you've got an agent looking after the property. They usually charge around 7% of the rent. And let's say there's some repairs and maintenance for wear and tear caused by the tenants. And let's say that's about $900 a year. So your expenses are $4,000. So your rent minus your expenses is $9,000. But of course you've borrowed money to buy that property, and let's assume you have borrowed $180,000, so there's interest to pay on that loan. Now I'll use 9.5%. Whenever I do my sums for a rental property, I tend to use a percentage rate 2 or 3% higher than what it is at the moment, because interest rates go in cycles too. They can go down fairly fast and up fairly fast. So to have a comfort level, if you pick a rate that's 2 or 3% higher than what they are currently, and you know you can afford that rate, when rates do go up, you're comfortable with the loan. You're not forced into a position of weakness or some sort of disaster story where you're forced to sell your property. So let's say interest is $17,000 a year. Your net income is 9, so you're making a loss of $8,000. So it's costing you $8,000 to hold that property. But the tax laws in Australia are such that that $8,000 can be claimed as a tax deduction, so it can be taken off your other income from salary and wages or other business income or whatever income you've got. And that means that if your other income is reduced by $8,000, your tax is reduced by your tax rate on that $8,000. So assuming that you're earning between $20,000 and $60,000, your tax rate is 30 cents in the dollar, or about 30%. So you would get a tax benefit, a tax refund at the end of the year of $2,400. So really, after the tax benefit, that property has cost you $5,600 for the year, or about $100 a week. But if you can find a fairly new property, which we'll go into later on, you can also claim depreciation on the cost of the building and things inside the house, such as the stove, hot water service, carpets, light fittings, oven, air conditioner, that sort of thing. And that can be a big advantage tax-wise, because what that means is, if you can claim depreciation on the investment property you've bought, you might have building depreciation of $2,000, and you might have $4,000 depreciation on all those fittings that I mentioned. So that's $6,000 of depreciation you can claim, and once again your tax rate's 30%, so that means you could claim a further $6,000 as a tax deduction and save a further $1,800 in tax. And that $1,800 in tax savings brings that down to a loss of about $3,800 you would have to pay out, which is about $75 a week. So you could buy a $200,000 house that's fairly new with depreciation claims, and it will cost you about $75 a week. Of course, the risk in property is if you pay $75 a week for 24 years, it means you've forked out about $100,000. So that property has to appreciate by at least $100,000 for you to break even. So the risk of buying property is, it is dangerous to buy at these peaks because it can take so much longer to get that capital growth. So you've got to look at market cycles as well. Now, what sort of property do you buy? What we'll go through now is things you should look for when you're looking at investment property. One of the most important things is the median price range of the property in the area you're looking in. That's not the average price, because the average price can be distorted in that area there might be a very expensive house sold which distorts the average. It means the average is higher than what it would normally be. But you can get prices for the area through real estate agents, and how the median price range works is, if that's price and that's number of sales, this is all about doing your homework. Buying an investment property is a big amount to invest, so you need to do your homework to make sure you're buying the right investment. And if you plotted all the house sales in that area over a period of time, it would go something like that. So, in the area you're looking at, cheaper houses, there's not as many sold. Middle of the road, there's quite a lot sold, and not many more expensive houses sold. With an investment property, to play safe, you try and buy in that median price range. That means that if ever you do have to sell, you're forced to sell for whatever reason, you're going to be able to sell fairly quickly because the demand's there. That's the sort of property people are looking for in that area. And you won't be put in a position of weakness having a property here or here where you're forced to sell, where there's a downturn in the markets, or you've got to sell quickly and you could lose money. So the first point is to buy a property in the median price range in the area you're looking at. Now, what also helps if you can, which I mentioned before, is to buy a fairly new property. If you buy a property that's constructed after 1985, you can claim depreciation on the actual cost of the building. So you might buy a house for $200,000, the land value might be $120,000, but the building might have cost $80,000 to construct, and you can claim depreciation at 2.5% on that building, which gives you that tax advantage I showed earlier when working out what it costs you to hold that investment property. So $80,000 construction costs at 2.5% is $2,000 you can claim in building depreciation each year for 40 years. So obviously if you can find one that's not very old, only several years old, you've got a longer time to claim that depreciation rather than one that's 15 years old. And with a newer property there's less maintenance, less hassles. So you spend less on repairs and have less phone calls from the tenants and that sort of thing. Now, if you can avoid selling your investment property, obviously avoid selling. Sometimes you have to through personal circumstances, family reasons or whatever, but try and avoid selling it, because what happens, you lose equity once you sell a property. Because if you've originally bought a property for $100,000 and over time it's grown to $200,000, let's say that $100,000 includes all your costs, your stamp duty and so on, and that $200,000 is after paying an agent, conveyancing fees and so on, it means you've made a profit of $100,000. Now, if you've held that property less than 12 months, you'd have to pay capital gains tax on that whole $100,000 at your tax rate. If you've held it longer than 12 months, you only have to pay tax on half of that, $50,000. But if your tax rate's 30 cents in the dollar, your capital gains tax would be $15,000. If your tax rate's higher, 48 cents in the dollar, you lose nearly half of that, $25,000. So once you sell a property for whatever reason, and sometimes you're tempted to sell because it has gone up, but you do lose equity, because not only will you have to pay capital gains tax, there'll be fees in selling, agents' fees and so on. You could lose $25,000 out of that $100,000 gain, and that's $20,000 that you haven't got to reinvest into something else. You had something worth 200, now you've only got something worth 180. Now, which area to buy in? Once again, it's personal circumstances. You need to sit down with an accountant who understands property, and you find that inner city areas tend to grow at about 2% higher than the outer areas. So, you know, your inner city area in Adelaide might grow at 7 to 8% per year, and the outer suburban areas might grow at 5 to 6%. So if you want capital growth, obviously you buy in the inner city areas, but if you want income or higher rent compared to the value of the property, you buy in your outer areas. Inner city areas, your net rental income after your council rates, water rates and other expenses might only be 3% of the value of the property, whereas some of the outer suburbs you can get 7 or 8% of the value of the property. So depending on your own income and how much disposable income you've got to invest, you can look at either or, inner or outer suburban. Of course, these figures are slightly misleading because you find in the inner suburban areas, people do spend money on renovating, and there's no record of how much people spend. So although it might show a 7 or 8% or 10% return, capital growth, we're not sure how much people spend on new kitchens, bathrooms, additions, that sort of thing. Now, regarding loans and interest on loans, you've got a choice between fixed and variable. A variable loan means that the interest rate fluctuates with the market, and fixed is you fix the rate for a certain time. When I first bought my office I'm in back in the late 80s, interest rates were 10%, but they went up to 17% fairly quickly, which makes it fairly uncomfortable and a bit of a struggle. So I'm all in favour of, when rates are low, to fix your rate for about 3 years, and you know where you stand then. You know your comfort level, your repayments. If rates go up, you're not in a position of weakness. So once again, it's personal circumstances, but just remember, when rates are low, think about fixing them. Also, the type of loan you can get is interest only or principal and interest. Interest only means you don't pay any of the principal off, you're just paying your interest as you go. Principal interest, you've borrowed a certain amount of money over a certain term, with the interest added on, that's divided over those number of years, and you just pay a fixed rate per month, so that over a period, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, your loan's definitely paid off. Being conservative, being an accountant, I quite like principal interest. I know that over a certain number of years, no matter what happens, if I make my repayments, I'm debt-free after a certain time. But if you're an aggressive investor, you want to keep accumulating investment properties, you go for interest only, so that you're not using your capital paying off a loan. You've got more equity available, then more capital available to reinvest in another property. You're paying the least amount of outgoings possible on that rental property by paying interest only. But that really is for a more aggressive investor who wants to accumulate properties or investments. Sometimes people ask me, when do I buy a property? I'm not sure whether I can afford it or not. Once again, if you sit down and do those sums we do earlier, where you find a property, work out the average rental income, your council, water, insurance, agents' fees, maintenance and so on, or if it's a unit, strata fees, and work out what you can afford after the tax benefit, depending on your taxable income. At least you get a good idea what you're going to be up for. But a good rule of thumb of knowing when you could afford to buy another property is to look at your own house you're living in, try and find out how much rent you could get for that house, And if that's roughly the same as the interest portion you're paying on your home loan repayment, about equal, you should be fairly comfortable to go and borrow and buy another property. So that's just a rough rule of thumb. Some clients of ours don't use real estate agents or property managers, but I tend to favour using a property manager. You don't get the phone call on a Sunday night where the tenant's asking you to come and change a light globe, or you might be very lucky for a couple of years having good tenants, but once they move out, you've got another tenant in, and if you are unlucky with a bad tenant, and especially a bad tenant who knows the law, you've got someone who might stop paying rent, you can't evict, and it causes all sorts of problems. The other advantage of a property manager is they've been to the tribunal before, they know the ropes, they know what legal letters to write and that sort of thing. So I'm in favour of using a property manager. One thing you've got to be careful of is buying properties that offer rental guarantees, and a lot of them emanate from seminars, especially out of Queensland, and usually the seminar person, the marketers, the bank, the real estate agent are all in cahoots with each other, and they're all sharing in the commissions. And what they do, by offering a rent guarantee, it makes all the figures look good. When I did that example earlier showing $13,000 a year rent, or $230 a week or whatever it is, it makes all the figures look quite good, and you think, I can afford $75 a week. And you'll get that rental income for the guarantee period, say 2 years. But what happens if that's not the true rent? Let's say the true rent is $50 less than that, then you can be in trouble. And for example, if I'm looking at a property that I buy and they've given me a rental guarantee of $200 a week, I might say that that property is worth at least $150,000, at least that, when I do my sums and my return on investment and so on. But once that rental guarantees period is finished, and I find that rental income is really only $150 a week, then that property might really only be worth $110,000. Compared to other investments, what I could invest in and what sort of return I get. So I've lost $40,000 overnight really. So you've got to be careful with rent guarantees and all those schemes. Really do your homework. Even go to the next suburb to look at a house that's 2 years old, similar to the one you're looking at buying, just to make sure that that is the true market value of that property. Because the biggest disaster in real estate is overpaying the asset price of the house, overpaying the value of the property. And it takes a long time to get your money back then. Now, regarding what rent to charge, you get two arguments. Charging the most you can get because it makes the value of the property look a bit better, or I tend to favour just undercharging slightly on the market rent. Because what happens, let's say I've got a house that I'm renting out and I know the market rent's $200 a week. If they're a good tenant, I'm quite happy to charge $180 a week. Or $190, say. Let's say I'm charging $190, $10 below the market rent. Now market rents go in cycles too, with vacancy rates on properties. You know, if there's an oversupply of properties, then there's vacancy rates and rental prices, rentals fall. So let's say market rents fall to $180 a week. Well, my tenant, they're going to save $20 a week by moving. So they'll probably move out and find another property at $180 a week. I'll continue trying to rent my property at $200 a week because that's what I'm used to. But after several months I'll realise that market rents have fallen, I'll lower my rent and find a new tenant and start over again. Whereas if I'm charging $190 a week, prices drop to $180, my tenant's not likely to move. One is, they know they've been paying slightly less than market rent, so they're quite happy with you as a landlord. And secondly, it's not worth moving for $10 a week. So that's a good reason to charge slightly below the market rental in your area. Now another question that's asked, you know, do I buy a home unit or a house? Looking at the figures over the years, there's not much difference capital growth wise between a house and a unit. They tend to grow at the same rates. But one thing with units or apartments you have to be very careful of is that in this area they can peak fairly high, and you can overpay for an apartment compared to what it'll be worth in a year or two once the market settles down. And a good rule of thumb is you should never buy an apartment if the cost of that apartment is similar to a house not far away on 600 or 700 square metres of land, because that's a property that you own that land, torrents title, you can sell that property, you can develop it, you can do what you want at any time in the future, whereas an apartment is fairly restricted. You can't go and knock the house down and build some townhouses or whatever. So when there's an oversupply of apartments, prices do fall, and can fall pretty quickly. You can lose a fair bit of money. So be very careful of buying apartments near the peak, especially when not far away you can buy a house on land that you own. If you are buying a unit or apartment, just make sure you look at the past community title or strata title minutes of meetings, so that you can see if there's any larger levies coming up. You know, you might be hit with a $5,000 painting levy 6 months after you move in if you're not aware that those things have been discussed by the unit owners. Even go and talk to the other apartment or unit owners about the property. So we're looking at investing in property. You've really got three choices. One is you don't do anything, you don't buy an investment property, or you buy something that's negatively geared. That is, as I've said before, geared means borrowed, negative means that your expenses are more than your income. Or you find a property that's neutrally geared or positively geared, which can usually be found if it's a fairly new property and you've got high depreciation claims. You can find that it doesn't cost you that much at all to keep that property, and sometimes in rare circumstances your income is high. After your tax claims, your income is higher than your expenses. So if you've got a choice, number one is not an option, do nothing. Whether it's a rental property or some other investment, you have to invest money. You've got to put away for retirement. We've had 20 years of fantastic returns on the markets, but that's, at the moment, that's over, and there's a golden rule of investing that low returns follow high returns. So we could be in for 20 years of fairly low returns, so you need to save even more to have a nest egg in retirement. So doing nothing is not an option. Number one option is obviously to find a property that doesn't cost you that much to run. Something that's neutrally geared, positively geared, or slightly negatively geared, that might only cost you so much a week, because it means that you're comfortable, you can afford it, and it means sooner you can go and buy another property or another investment. Negatively geared, you just have to be aware that it's costing you each week. The property has to appreciate in value, which history has shown over the last 100 years properties in Australia do. But obviously it just takes you that much longer to recoup your costs compared to this option. So, just to reiterate, it's very important to sit down with someone who knows all those issues I've talked about, depreciation, rentals, type of property, and do your sum so that you know what it's going to cost you after everything. And as I've mentioned, disasters in real estate occur when you're forced to sell when you're not ready to, and you can lose a lot of money if you've bought at a peak, you've got to sell 3 or 4 years later, and the markets haven't bounced back yet. So you can lose a fair amount of money. So speak to an accountant, sit down, go through your figures, and follow those rules I've just been through, and at least you're most of the way there. So I hope this video has been of benefit to you, and thanks for watching. Thank you.